Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani, and again, taking lots of questions these days and answering questions that people have about their narcissistic situations. This was based on a couple of questions we got, and it related to people saying, what do we do when we have to take more serious, severe action in a relationship where there's narcissistic or other kinds of antagonistic dynamics present in the relationship, right? And in these cases, there was like more and more escalation. The yelling was becoming threats, and it felt like you were almost like on the cusp of it becoming violent, right? Or that, the behavior was so loud and so agitated that neighbors could hear it, that children were getting really upset. And this can raise all kinds of questions, like, involving law enforcement. Is there going to be a need for an arrest? The evoking of things like restraining orders. But then there's another piece of this, which also relates to if a person with an antagonistic personality is claiming they're going to hurt themselves or end their lives. And then there's even times when a person might have an antagonistic personality, but is also using drugs or alcohol. And their behavior is agitating to a way that it feels incredibly out of control because they're completely disinhibited because of the presence of drugs and alcohol, but have been very, very stubborn against engaging in treatment. And because of this escalation in behavior, there needs to be more escalated intervention. And that they're not going to listen to you, and they're sure as hell not going to get help. So when there are these escalations, that this is going beyond the typical arguments you're having, or it's an escalation, like I said, whether it's due to threatened or actual violence, whether it's due to threats of harm to oneself, the narcissistic person is threatening to harm themselves, or whether it's an escalation due to drugs or alcohol in a narcissistic person. A lot of people say, I don't know what to do. Now, we will be providing some resources in the notes to this video, but this video is also to say this is very, very complicated for people. And this video is really a validation of why this is so complicated. One thing that has come up in many, many people that I have talked to and interviewed over the years, worked with clinically, is this sense of guilt. And a lot of that guilt relates to the possibility of an arrest, right? So there's been a violent episode in a relationship, and there is and then law enforcement is called either by you or even by a neighbor, and then people will say, oh my God, I feel so guilty. I don't want the parent of my child to be arrested for this. I'm not trying to ruin their lives, all of that. My response to that is basically, I get it. I'm not going to say, well, that's not a thing. It is a thing. It's a very, very big thing. And a lot of people then will feel shamed. They're like, I'm afraid of these ramifications. And one thing that comes up a lot with law enforcement, they'll say, we'll come there and nobody wants to press charges. Nowadays, domestic violence reporting laws have changed around the country. So even depending on the state you're in, those laws have changed and law enforcement will get involved either way. And it doesn't matter if somebody doesn't want to press charges. It's as though they saw someone get assaulted on the street. They're going to act at that behest. This is going to change depending where in the world and what state in the United States that you're watching this. The key issue in all of this is safety, 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 right? That a person who's escalating, and especially if there's other dangers present, things like firearms, anything else that can be weaponized, which is a lot of stuff in a household, that as that escalates, that you now have a situation that there's no turning back from. And whether it's yourself, others that are in the environment, including pets that could get harmed, there's no going backwards from that. And so this feeling, though, of guilt that if law enforcement comes and this person gets arrested, and all the ramifications of that may not be small. It could be a loss of a career. It could be a loss of reputation in the world. It could put threat to things like immigration status. There's a lot of things that could happen. So with all of these issues, this is why for so many folks who are even sensing that buildup, that head of steam, violence may not have been happening, but it may have been threatened in a relationship, or things would escalate, or even the first time an object is thrown across a room, even if it's not thrown at you, it is absolutely crucial that you work with a local domestic violence program. Their clinicians, their advocates will be in a position to walk you through what the range of responses are. But that sense of guilt is what often stops a lot of people. However, talking to an agency could just be having a conversation, having your experience heard, and that could be an essential first step to coming up with a safety plan that will ultimately be just that, a safety plan that would protect you, protect your kids, protect other people in the circumstance. This also takes us to this place of protective orders and all of that, and that's a thorny issue. In the majority of cases, sadly enough, protective orders can often result in an uptick in violence, where especially when a person is antagonistic or narcissistic, finds that this has happened, because in order for a person to have a protective order, they have to be served, right? That they now know this is happening. An uptick at that point is not unusual. Again, this is not a video meant to that's prescriptive and is going to have the answers. This is why working with a domestic violence program becomes absolutely crucial, as well as being able to present an evidence base for why this is needed. Because it's not as simple as saying, I need protection. Because the people who offer these, who are basically taking away someone else's constitutional rights, saying you can't go here and you can't go there without them having committed a crime yet, in order for that to happen, at least in the United States, there has to be some evidence to that. And so many people get frustrated when it's not issued the way they had hoped, or for a shorter period of time they wanted, or that there is an escalation. So the safety plan, just not assuming that these kinds of protections will protect you, becomes important. Working with domestic violence programs becomes important. But what about the other issue? That the threat is not towards you, but it's towards themselves. Now, when there is somebody who's threatening to harm themselves, this is as dangerous as them saying they're going to harm you. First of all, depending on how they're going to harm themselves, there can be collateral harm, number one. And number two, anytime someone says they're going to harm themselves, you have to take it seriously. That's what every therapist on the planet has been trained to do, is to take it seriously. And if you're not a therapist, you have to take it really seriously. One of the hardest things is that many people in these situations, and it doesn't, at this point, I think a lot of people say, well, what if they're manipulating me? And I'd say that's probably not the conversation you want to have. I think the problem is, though, is many times people will say, well, I can fix this. They said, if you just come back, then I won't do this. This is a person who's just told you they're going to harm themselves. That's a mental health emergency. That would be like somebody saying, hey, if you come back, then this bone I just broke is going to set itself. That's how it works. They have to go and get the bone set in an emergency room. The same thing applies here. And one thing I've told everyone I've ever worked with, if you are in a relationship with someone who is threatening to harm themselves in a significant way, there's no conversation to be had. Emergency services would need to be called. Because a couple of things happen then. To whatever degree this could be something to keep you close, well, then that's not happening anymore. You've now said, I'm going to call the appropriate entity to keep you safe. Could this make this person angrier at you? 1,000% yes. Absolutely, they will get angrier at you. And I know for a lot of people that feels overwhelming. And it brings up that sense of grief. It brings up that sense of guilt. It brings up that sense of fear. There are a lot of strong feelings that go with that. But at the end of the day, you are not a psychiatric emergency room. You are a person who is in a very, very difficult relationship with someone. The last place that this is going to get solved is with you. And you going back to them is merely then going to be, now you're with a person who is very, very fragile. They need help. And some people say, well, what if this is just all a ways to keep me close? Well, you ensuring that they're getting emergency services means that if this is a true emergency, then you've taken the steps needed to be taken to keep them safe. You're not taking it upon yourself to try to do something that is beyond any of our skill sets if this is someone close to us. Even a psychiatrist, even a psychologist, if this is happening to someone close in their lives. would have to make that call to say, I need to involve emergency services. You don't do surgery on your own kid, basically. So nobody's doing that at home. And what also does happen is if this is a toxic dance, where a person's like, the only way I'm going to stop saying this is if you come be close to me. Well, you've ended that dance because you're saying, I need to make sure you're safe. It is the most compassionate thing you can do, is to get those services for someone at the time of acute crisis. If that's what someone is sharing, always believe them. A way to think about this is that you taking, especially a sort of a self-harm crisis seriously, especially with somebody who has an antagonistic personality, interestingly, it also becomes its own kind of boundary. You're saying like, no, I am not going to be the one who stays up all night and tries to fix this. I'm going to try to get you to the people where you can be helped, right? And let me give you a sort of an inside piece of information. What gets super tricky is if you go into this person's phone and figure out like, oh, this is their therapist. You reach out to their therapist. We have a law we have to honor called confidentiality. I'll be frank with you, if somebody called me up and said, hey, your patient such and such, talk to me, this is going to happen. The therapist's hand in some ways is somewhat tied because they're not getting that information from their client, which might be the person you're in a relationship with or is in your family or whatever, and they can't confirm or deny to you that this is their client because we have to preserve the confidentiality of the client. So if you're in a relationship with somebody who will sometimes threaten self-harm, at times maybe that things aren't going the way they want or they're trying to draw you close, if you know that that's something that's going to happen in one of the good periods where it's not tense, it's actually really important to have something that feels like a safety plan, that feels less escalated, like having to call ambulances and involve entities that you feel like that may not necessarily be safe for this person either. So that might even be, for example, a release to be able to call a therapist at times of emergency. So then that therapist has that and says, okay, I'm allowed to talk to this person and get them services. So the challenges here become that as things escalate in these relationships, many, many times people say, I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel comfortable leveling this up to the next step. And like I said, I'm validating that. I'm not going to sit here and say, you have no choice. You have to do this because then you're going to shut this video off. But to understand that guilt and the fear are very real. But what it means is that if there is a circumstance where things have escalated to that point where, in fact, law enforcement or some other assistance has to be called in or emergency services have to be called in, this relationship is no longer something you can handle on your own. Now, whether this means therapy for yourself, because you may not necessarily be able to compel this person into therapy, because what could happen is when the emergency services come, that the person who's threatening to harm themselves saying, we were just having an argument, like it just got out of hand, nothing's going on. Now you're left in a circumstance where you called help, they're incensed at you. So that's why working with advocates, therapists, counselors, social workers who get this, to have a better safety plan in place becomes absolutely essential. And here's the other thing to keep in mind. If you do not have documentation, for example, a police report or something like that, when even a police report of someone being called to the home when things got escalated in the house, then in family court, if you assert all these terrible things happen in the relationship, the odds of it being heard drop precipitously without that sort of record of it happening. But then there are the things that happen within you. One of the most complicated things in these relationships, and again, we can sit here in judgment and say, how ridiculous that somebody wants to stay in a relationship with somebody who wants to harm them. Okay, sure, whatever. But then that's not predicated on what we know about trauma bonding. That's not predicated on what we know about what these relationships do to people's psyches and minds and trauma systems and all of that. And for some people, they'll fear that if I actually step up and get the help we need, whether that's law enforcement getting involved or emergency services getting involved, that I might lose them. many, many folks I have worked with have said, I'm not ready to let this go. And I know that if I turn to these other entities, I may very well lose this person, and I'm not ready to lose them. Again, this is one where I'm saying no video in the world is going to answer this. This is why therapy, because every case is so different from the other one, is that therapy becomes so important for your case, for you to understand what it is in your life history. What is it that specifically happened in this particular relationship? What is the nature of trauma bonding in this relationship that's leading you in this place where you're trying to keep this person safe, you're trying to keep yourself safe, and yet you're afraid of losing them. Then there's also that fear that it will get worse if you do actually try to do something. So that if you do try to bring in other entities, other parties, heck, you even involve the neighbors, that things will get worse the next time. It's a very, very reasonable fear. One of the big challenges we don't talk about enough, I even don't talk about it enough on this channel, is that this isn't as simple as a person's narcissistic and then they're bad. Not at all. These are people we love. These are family members. These are siblings, these are parents, these are quite often partners, they might even be adult children. And you may feel love for them, and you want to protect them. And you may feel like, okay, I can ensure they will be safe. I don't want to involve other people. I will feel bad. This will go off the rails. They won't want to have anything to do with me. All of these complexities mean that you need support. These are not calls you can make. And like I said, even people who are trained in this, when it is somebody they care about and love, all that training in some ways starts to become a lot less objective when it's somebody who's close in your life that you care about. And I think so many times we're like, there's no way you could love someone who hit you. The hell you can't. Every day it happens thousands and thousands of times a day that somebody still feels very much a sense of love for someone who's verbally abusing them, physically abusing them, or financially harming them in any number of ways. So I suppose that this culmination of questions is what do we do? How are we supposed to feel when we have to take more significant action in a narcissistic relationship that is escalating to a more dangerous place? Again, there's research out there that shows that narcissism is associated with all forms of aggression and violence. Verbal aggression counts. But as this escalates, what does have to happen is that talking to a domestic violence program that doesn't commit you to leaving a relationship, talking to a domestic violence program doesn't mean that you are betraying your relationship. It means you're getting support. It means you're getting information. It means you're setting up a safety plan. And remember, this safety plan may not just be for you. It may be for the other folks in the household or any living thing in the household. And it may also be for the narcissistic person themselves. We do know from the literature that especially in cases of vulnerable narcissism, the rates of self-harm escalating are actually higher than they would be for sort of a person who doesn't have those issues. So these issues can be very real, and this is someone you care about and you want to keep safe. Does that necessarily mean this will all come to a soft landing? Absolutely not. And the fears of escalation, the fears of it getting worse, the fears of losing this person are often based on those things could happen. But this is also about you. This is where the healing from narcissistic relationships is a hell of a lot harder when things get to this severe level. We've been talking about continuums a lot. Mild, moderate, severe. This kind of escalation tends to be something we see in the more severe cases. And many of you who are going through relationships where it is a more severe manifestation of an antagonistic or narcissistic personality, you may feel very alone with this. You'll say, this isn't just about someone writing shady stuff on social media. This isn't about someone flirting with a barista. This isn't about someone who's cheating on me. Like, this is about something that feels like a crisis every day. And when we mix drugs and alcohol in that mix, and we know that narcissism and addiction are highly overlapping, when you throw that into the mix, the dysregulation that we already see as part of narcissism completely escalates. The manipulation we see as part of narcissism is far, far more when a person is using. So that also adds a piece to this too. But I think because of trauma bonding, many folks in narcissistic relationships truly believe that they have to be able to take care of everything themselves, have all the answers, be able to do all the safety planning, be able to manage this situation. It takes a team, and even a team of mental health practitioners would have trouble managing one of these situations. There's no way you could manage it yourself, especially when you're so close into it and it's still a relationship that brings up a lot of conflicting feelings. So I think the really big takeaway on this, and again, there will be resources, multiple resources listed in the video notes, is that when it even feels like you're at the beginning of a relationship that is starting to have the feel of escalation, and I'm not just talking about intimate relationships. This could be happening with an adult child. This could be happening with other family members. Whomever it is, that you're going to need help. And many times, therapy, a domestic violence program, those are places to begin. Most areas have some access to that. And then there are hotlines where there are people you can speak to at all times to get guidance on how to approach in your situation, and understanding that there sometimes are issues around race and immigration status and other factors that can make people very anxious about turning to other entities. That's understandable because institutional systems don't always work the way we want. But at the end of the day, from my seat as a psychologist in your life, safety is the most important thing. And the best way to plan for safety is to have a plan that you're not constructing when everything's falling apart, but something that you've thought about before it gets to that point. Doesn't make it easy, and none of this is easy. But when these relationships do escalate, and they often don't, but when they do, the more you feel like there's places and resources you can turn to, at least you'll feel at least some things to grab onto, some anchors to consider. So I hope this gives you some help, and I hope the resources we provide in this video can also provide some guidance. Thanks again.